Imagine standing on solid ground, and within 1 hour, that ground is gone. Not flooded, not damp. Gone, somewhere on earth, in a valley that no longer exists on any map. A man stood at the door of a wooden structure, the size of a small city, and he listened to the sky begin to tear open. For 120 years, he had been building something nobody believed they would ever need. His neighbors mocked him. His own family whispered doubts in private. And then, on a single morning, the mocking stopped forever. What actually happened during those 40 days has fascinated theologians, scientists, archaeologists, and skeptics for thousands of years. Was it a local event, or something that swallowed the entire world? What did it feel like to be trapped inside a wooden vessel while everything you had ever known disappeared beneath the waves? And what happened to the people who refused to listen? This is the story of Noah's flood. Not the cartoon version, with smiling giraffes poking their heads out of windows. The real story. The terrifying, historically debated, spiritually massive event that the book of Genesis says reshaped the entire human race. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand the flood, you first have to understand why it happened. Genesis chapter 6 opens with a haunting sentence. It says that God saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. Not sometimes evil. Not mostly evil. Only evil continually. This wasn't a world of a few bad people among many good ones. According to the text, humanity had reached a point of near total moral collapse. Ancient Near Eastern scholars point out that violence, or chamas in Hebrew, is repeated as the defining sin of this era. It's a word that means more than crime. It implies corruption of justice itself, a world where the strong devoured the weak, and no one stopped it. Into this darkness walks one man. Genesis 6:9 describes him simply, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, and he walked with God. Not perfect, not sinless, but faithful, in a world where faithfulness had almost disappeared. God tells Noah what is coming. Not a storm, not a drought. An end. Genesis 6:13 records God saying that the end of all flesh had come before him, and that he would destroy them with the earth. Now Noah is given a task so massive, it defies belief. Build a vessel 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. To put that in perspective, that's longer than a modern soccer field, and roughly the height of a 4-story building. Built entirely from wood, sealed inside and out with pitch, with only one door and a single row of windows near the roof. There were no blueprints for something like this in human history. No shipyard, no crane, no steel beams. Just timber, ropes, and obedience. For a century, Noah worked. Historians studying ancient timber construction note that a project on this scale, using primitive tools, would demand years of continuous labor from a large workforce. Yet the Bible gives no indication Noah had an army of builders. Some scholars suggest he had help from his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Others believe the surrounding community may have been hired for labor, unknowingly building their own means of exclusion. Every single day, Noah hammered another beam into place, while people walked past and laughed. 2 Peter 2:5 calls him a herald of righteousness, suggesting Noah didn't just build in silence. He warned people. Every plank he nailed was also a sermon nobody wanted to hear. And then, one day, the warning stopped, because the time had come. Genesis 7:11 gives us an almost frighteningly precise date, in the 600th year of Noah's life. In the 2nd month, on the 17th day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of heaven were opened. This single verse describes something far more violent than rain. The fountains of the great deep burst open, not overflowed. Burst. Some geologists and biblical researchers have proposed that this phrase describes catastrophic ruptures in the Earth's crust, possibly along fault lines, releasing enormous volumes of subterranean water and steam upward with explosive force. Whether or not this reflects an actual geological mechanism remains debated among scientists, and mainstream geology does not support a global flood model. But textually, the language is unmistakable. This wasn't gentle. This was the earth itself breaking. At the very same moment, the windows of heaven were opened. Water didn't just fall. It came down as though restraints had been removed from the sky itself. Try to imagine the sound, not rainfall pattering on a rooftop, a roar, a pressure in the chest, thunder that never stopped rolling, and beneath your feet, the ground trembling as it split somewhere far below. Inside the ark, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, 8 people in total, sealed themselves inside, alongside pairs of every kind of animal. And then, According to Genesis 7:16, the door was shut, not by Noah. The text says, God himself shut them in. There's something devastating in that detail. Once that door closed, there was no going back. No one left outside could change their mind. No one inside could go rescue someone at the last moment. The decision point had passed. Outside, the water began to rise. What was it like for the people who had mocked Noah for 100 years? The Bible does not dwell on their suffering with graphic detail, but it doesn't hide the horror either. Genesis 7:21-23 states plainly that everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. Imagine the panic. Rooftops crowded with desperate people. Livestock screaming in flooded fields. Families climbing higher and higher onto hillsides that were shrinking by the hour. Every place people once considered safe, disappearing beneath brown, churning water. There would have been no warning sirens, no emergency broadcasts, just the realization, growing more terrifying by the minute, that there was nowhere left to run. And inside the ark, 8 people and thousands of animals sat in near total darkness, feeling the vessel lift off the ground for the first time. Then came the 40 days. This is where most retellings stop paying attention to detail, but the text is much more specific than people remember. Genesis 7:12 tells us rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. But that was only the beginning. Genesis 7:24 adds something most people miss entirely. The waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. 40 days of rain, then 150 days where the waters simply remained, covering everything. That means Noah and his family weren't just riding out a storm. They were living through nearly half a year of confinement before the water even began to recede. What would that actually feel like? No sunlight beyond the narrow window near the roof, the constant creak of timber under pressure, the smell of animals, feed, and salt water mixing together in an enclosed space, the rhythmic, endless rocking of the vessel on water, with no land in sight in any direction. Jewish tradition, particularly within rabbinic commentary, found in texts like the Midrash, imagines Noah and his family working around the clock simply to keep the animals fed and cared for, barely sleeping, moving from pen to pen in the dark. Whether or not every detail of these traditions is historically verified, they capture something true about the sheer physical and emotional endurance the situation would have demanded. There would have been grief, too, whatever their scenes. These were still Noah's neighbors, his extended family, possibly. People he had lived beside for 600 years, and now they were gone, and he could do nothing but listen to the water outside and wait. Then, finally, Genesis 8:1 offers one of the most quietly powerful lines in the entire Bible. But God remembered Noah. After all that destruction, after months of silence, this verse marks the turning point. And immediately after it, we're told God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters began to subside. The flood didn't end the moment it began to recede. It receded, gradually, agonizingly, slowly. Genesis 8:3 tells us the water continued receding for 150 more days before the ark finally came to rest. And where did it rest? Genesis 8:4 gives us a location that still captivates explorers today, the mountains of Ararat. For centuries, expeditions have searched the mountains of eastern Turkey, hoping to find physical remains of the ark. Reports of wood fragments, strange formations, and satellite anomalies have surfaced again and again and again and again. They've failed to produce verified, scientifically confirmed evidence. No mainstream archaeological body has confirmed the ark's location, but the search itself reveals something important. This story has never simply faded into myth. Generation after generation, people have believed it mattered enough to go looking. Even after the ark settled on the mountain, Noah's ordeal wasn't over. He sent out a raven, which flew back and forth, but didn't return. Then he sent a dove, which found no place to rest and came back to him. Genesis 8:11 describes one of the most iconic images in the entire Bible. 7 days later, the dove returned again, this time with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak. Think about the emotional weight of that single leaf after nearly a year sealed inside a wooden structure, surrounded by death, uncertainty, and the unknown. This small green leaf was the first proof that life had survived, that the earth was healing, that there was still a world waiting for them. Even then, Noah waited. He didn't rush the door open the moment he saw dry ground in the distance. Genesis 8:15-16 tells us that God had to instruct him to finally leave the ark. Some Bible scholars find this detail remarkable. After everything Noah endured, after all his obedience, he still waited for permission rather than acting on his own judgment. It's a quiet but powerful picture of restraint after crisis. Now let's step back and ask the question. Historians and scientists have argued over 4 centuries. Was this flood global or local? This remains one of the most debated topics in biblical scholarship. Some interpreters argue for a truly global flood, pointing to phrases like, all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered, in Genesis 7:19, as clear evidence of a planet-wide event. Others argue for a massive regional flood, centered in the ancient Mesopotamian river valleys, so catastrophic and far-reaching that, from the perspective of the people experiencing it, it would have appeared to cover the entire known world. Interestingly, flood narratives appear across many ancient cultures, far beyond the biblical account. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh includes a strikingly similar flood story, with a warned survivor building a massive vessel to escape divine judgment. Ancient Chinese, Greek, and Mesoamerican traditions all include their own catastrophic flood accounts as well. Whether these stories share a common historical root, or emerged independently from shared human experience with devastating floods, remains a topic scholars continue to explore. What's clear is that this wasn't an isolated story invented in one culture. Something about total catastrophe by water echoes across nearly every ancient civilization on Earth. Modern geologists have proposed various natural explanations for a massive regional flood in the ancient world, including catastrophic changes at the end of the last ice age, sudden sea level rise, or the flooding of the Black Sea basin thousands of years ago. None of these theories are universally accepted, and the debate continues among both religious and secular scholars. What almost never gets discussed, though, is the emotional and spiritual weight the story carries beyond the historical debate. After the water finally receded, Noah did something remarkable. Before building a home, before replanting a field, before anything else, Genesis 8:20 tells us he built an altar and offered a sacrifice. Genesis 8:21 gives us God's response, and it might be the most important verse in the entire story. God promised never to destroy the earth by flood again, and he set a sign in the sky as a permanent reminder of that promise: a rainbow. Every single time you have ever looked up at a rainbow after a storm, you were looking at a symbol thousands of years old, a visual reminder woven into weather itself of a promise made after the worst catastrophe in human history. So what does this ancient, terrifying, almost unimaginable story actually mean for us today? At its core, the flood narrative isn't really about water. It's about the tension between judgment and mercy, corruption and integrity, and the cost of standing alone when everyone around you has chosen a different path. Noah wasn't spared because he was perfect. He was spared because, in a world that had abandoned moral responsibility entirely, he chose to remain faithful, even when faithfulness looked foolish. Even when it meant spending 100 years building something everyone mocked. Even when it meant enduring nearly a full year trapped in darkness, with no guarantee of what waited on the other side. There's something deeply human in that. All of us, at some point, face pressure to abandon what we know is right, simply because everyone around us has already moved on. The flood story asks a quiet, uncomfortable question across thousands of years. When everything around you is collapsing, what will you choose to hold on to? The rain eventually stopped. The waters eventually receded. And on a mountainside somewhere in the ancient world, 8 people stepped out onto dry ground and started the world over again. If you enjoyed exploring the Bible in this way, don't forget to subscribe for more biblical journeys.